this summer. During our vacation, my family and I set out in an early and frankly rather harried fashion from a dock in Ventura, California, out into the Pacific toward the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. It's a little over an hour offshore, and we landlubbers in the Ladd family imagined ourselves to be ancient mariners or pirates full of adventure on that crowded ferry, standing in the salt spray at the bow of the ship. We spent our time among the islands. We tired out our muscles paddling in and out of sea caves and against the wind in two-person kayaks. And since my partner in the kayaking adventure was a boy who had just turned 6, you can imagine that his overall helpfulness was perhaps a net negative in the propulsion department. When we had shared these adventures and the sun was finally dipping, we made our way back to the appointed time in the ferry dock for the return trip. The clouds had cleared, as any of you who have spent time in Southern California know that they always do, and it was hot, and we were tired, and we had eaten all of our snacks. And so we settled into the comfortable stupor of vacationers on the tail end of something amazing. Content to not pay too much attention, to nod our way through an uneventful ride back home. Blinking into the waning sunshine while that ship hummed homeward, I heard someone yelling, and I looked up from my stupor. "Dolphin!" someone shouted again. I saw a fin. One fin slip in and out and up and down through the waves. How charming, I thought, a dolphin. And as my eyes adjusted and I kept blinking, the shapes around that boat rearranged themselves. From so many churning shadows into living things, it was not one dolphin. It was not a dozen. It was not 20, it was 30, 40, or more short-beaked common dolphins, smaller than their bottlenose cousins and yet almost eerily substantial in their collective bulk. We were surrounded. Everywhere the eye focused, everywhere you looked, there were more. Here a baby, there a group of 6, swimming in perfect unison. They raced into and out from under the boat in a manner that seemed frankly irresponsible of them. And they followed us not for 1 minute, but until the time schedule demanded that we mariners turn our backs on them toward shore and all of our various dinner reservations. We were creatures of timetables, of schedules to keep, ready to scatter to our assorted tourist destinations. The moment that boat came to dock back in Ventura, they were moving as one body, together in a way that we could not conceive, free in a way that we could never be, not for all of our choices and all of our responsibilities and all of our vast and unimaginable human powers. Pods of dolphins, you see. Like most of the great cetaceans, they are whole and unique cultures unto themselves. They move as one body not because it impacts the way they gather food or seek safety alone, but because they quite literally create for one another cultural norms that vary not just from species to species, but from pod to pod. Scientists have lately discovered, for instance, that humpback whales, the larger cousins of our shipboard traveling companion, humpback whales speak in a language of echolocation so precise and so specific that the dialects of different family groups may be utterly unintelligible to whales from different pods. Recent scholarship has shown that whales, in fact, communicate richly, not just about the matters of survival, of food, but of meaning itself. That whales communicate among one another so richly, in fact, that some scientists, not theologians, not philosophers, but scientists have dared to say that whales seek meaning and practice their own variety of religion, of idealism, that whales have values which they share and communicate amongst themselves. Among the values expressed by these creatures, whom we just barely understand, is a certain embeddedness in each other's community, in the world itself, not a connection to the water or to each other, but an existence inseparable from it. And so the pod of dolphin on the California coast showed us that they were not in the ocean, but of the ocean, not among each other, but of each other. In this way, for a communal creature embedded in creation, it is not possible to see and admire one singular being among them. There could never have been one fin above the waves, because the world they inhabit is entirely different than the artificial aquarium environments we humans tend to coop them up in. In their embedded, interconnected state, there are no affected names. There is no show to put on. There are no stars of the show. There are no standouts. There are no individual cues and programmed responses. In fact, among them, there is not an individual to name and preen over and admire and control at all. Among them, there is not one body. There is only the whole and interdependent movement of beings living in the sea of the sea. I think on these things. I think of the great luxury of seeing them there on their own terms together like that. And I think on the fact that so much of my life, so much of our lives as people, especially in this country, and perhaps even especially in this congregation, especially here, so much of our lives are about expressing ourselves. About expressing ourselves, not as part of a larger whole, but as separate and individual beings who know things, have learned things, have messages to speak. How much of our lives are about discovering and defining ourselves as individuals, set apart and self-determined, the person, a see unto yourself, working on the therapist's couch and the congregation's sanctuary and the office boardroom to determine not who we are together, but who we are down deep individually in our essence, what our truest individual self might be, and how we could be made somehow purer by knowing that deeper individual self. I am always in conversation with myself. I am always asking who I am, what I believe, what I think, what I should do, what the moment demands of me. I am always swimming in my own sea, wondering if I know myself yet, wondering after all these years if my truest self has finally emerged. Does that sound familiar? Perhaps it is just me, but I don't think so. Because the truth is that I and we come by this quest for individual autonomy, for individual integrity. We come by this pretty honestly. In many ways, this separative individualism, this desire to know who you are apart from the whole, this individual personal responsibility is enshrined in the never fully realized ideals of this nation. It is similarly enshrined in even the most sacred values of this, our Unitarian Universalist tradition. For most of our history, Unitarian Universalism has been a gospel of individuality rather than an expression of collective identity. This place, our congregation, has prided itself for generations on being the one place where you can speak your mind, be who you are, as whole and dignified as a mighty oak rising alone. As UU religious educator Jill Schwindeman has written, Unitarian Universalism fiercely defends the work and self-determinacy of each person. We attempt to be receptive to each person's individual gifts, including those offered by those who are very young and others whose voices are not amplified. Where questions are welcomed, those on the outside find refuge. Some, in fact, argue that the central characteristic of who we are as religious liberals is this self-determinacy, following the example of Unitarians and Universalists who came before us. Following the wisdom of teachers like Siddhartha the Buddha, we have followed the wisdom to look for the truth within as to the only light. We are individualists because we believe that every person is powerful beyond measure and is responsible for wielding that great power with gentleness and with love. Does that sound like your congregation? And yet, as Schwindeman goes on to say, Unitarian Universalism challenges us to be faithful not only to ourselves, but to our social embeddedness. From the moment of our conception, she says, none of us exist except in relationship to others. And so no UU exists without the faith community that shapes us and is shaped by us. We know all these things. I am not saying anything new, which frankly I very seldom am. We are a part of a network in which every single part impacts the whole. We cannot escape this truth, and yet we Unitarian Universalists are chief among the people of this world who prefer to imagine ourselves as independently functioning creatures of basically free will, which is why I'm surprised. And I am delighted all over again. Every time I read all the way to the end of the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association, it is not that long a document. It is printed every single Sunday in your bulletin, and yet I too seldom read all the way to the end. Right there, underneath our noses, there is a bold theological statement overlooked almost every Sunday. The 7th principle of our Unitarian Universalist Association calls us toward respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. It is, as Susan said, the newest, the latest, and greatest of all of our statements of purpose among the Unitarian Universalists. At the time this congregation here on River Road was founded, there were in fact only 6 principles, which ended somewhat disappointingly in a call for our congregations, quote, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. At least there was that. Support and cooperation among all those men in all those lands. But what people right here at River Road and people beyond our congregation noted starting in the 1980s was that nowhere in our statement of shared purpose did we acknowledge our connection and accountability to the larger natural world. And so in 1985, on the floor of the UUA General Assembly, with almost 1,000 people in attendance, following the gospel message of Robert's Rules of Order, there emerged from among the Unitarian Universalists the final wording of what we now know as the 7th principle. Yes, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part is committee-drafted language, which will baffle me to my dying day. Because unlike most committee-drafted language, it is beautiful, and it is poetic, and it is perhaps far more radical than we were wholly cognizant of at the time. After all, the impetus behind the development of the 7th principle was to include a commitment to growing environmental concerns in the statement of purpose of our association. What emerged, however, was so much more than that. It was and is a deeply theological, even biological statement about the nature of existence itself. By claiming that we are held in an interconnected web to which we are responsible and upon which we are dependent, the 7th principle effectively undercuts hundreds of years of much vaunted American progressive individualism. For the first time in our history, in 1985, we declared in accepting that language that we are not our own, that we are embedded, not just in the water, but of it, not casting the net, but caught in it. The development of the seventh principle required us, this group of often heady, deeply responsible, often Western-leaning individualists, to admit in public that Indra's jeweled net is not just a story, but an existential reality, a bedrock aspect of what it means to be human. And the implications of that statement are far-reaching in ways that do not always speak good news or bright excitement, but always speak the truth. The Western mythos of separate individualism has held sway for a very long time, even in the face of very real scientific facts that have always questioned its assumptions. You can take your pick. Take your pick, whatever you choose, of all the great intellectual traditions of our age: biology, physics, philosophy, theology, sociology. Every single one of them point to the reality that you are not you outside of your embeddedness in and accountability to a larger whole. You are not you unless you are embedded. Do you know, for instance, that your body, just this physical form that you are carrying around with you this morning, do you know that your body is not an individual body at all, but an ecosystem in and of itself? Do you know that your very body is teeming with trillions of microbes right now where you sit in your chair? The collective bacteria, fungi, and microbes that live on and inside of us outnumber our own cells 10 to 1. There are more of them in you than there are you in you. In fact, there is no tissue in the entire human body that is sterile. There is no you that is pure. It never has been. To paraphrase Whitman out of context, you are large. You contain multitudes. And you could not live, let alone digest or reproduce or care or grow or vote or change the world if it were not so. In this way, on a purely biological level, you are not and never have been entirely your own. Physics shows us, as in our reading today, one that is continually a challenge to me because it never feels like enough, because it will never be enough compensation for the losses we know. And physics shows us that all the photons that ever bounced off your face, all the particles whose paths were interrupted by your smile, by the touch of your hair, hundreds of trillions of particles have raced off like children, their ways forever changed by you. You are impacting the cosmos, and you cannot move a single eyelash without being changed by every particle that surrounds you. You are not on this earth, you are of it. You are fully embedded, caught in the net, now and always. And yet the myth of separate individualism has driven us for generation after generation to allow ourselves the luxury of pushing conquest and dominion, as if one person could own all that they survey, or one nation could claim the luminous moon, as if one man could buy Greenland. We take this sea that we swim in, and we imagine that we are separate enough to own it, to mine it, to use it as a means to socially acceptable, selfishly individualistic ends. The myth of our separateness is at the heart of the plunder of this planet. It is at the heart of what is killing us, along with our own personal ecosystems that spiral out from these bodies into the greater cosmos in which we swim. And the theological challenge I have to offer in this big science sermon is simply this: can we rethink our assumptions about who we are? And can that transformation help us find new ways forward in this era that screams out for new ways of being human? We are not, of course, the solitary oaks, strong and true, aligned with our truest selves alone, pure and immune from the influences of all that surround us. In fact, trees have never been that anyway. Did you know that the redwoods, those queens of the forest, are in fact held together and allowed to be so tall only by the vast interconnected root systems that hold them all? Not even they are individuals, no more than a dolphin, no more than we ourselves. None of us stands alone, and we never have. If we live this seventh principle, live and love within an interdependent web, we might know on a more deeply personal level that we cannot own, cannot plunder, cannot take or procure or accumulate that which we are embedded in. Instead, thus interconnected, we might move as one body, shining into the waning sunlight, taking risks that seem foolish for the sake of the whole, bearing no imagined individual names, not one fin rising above the water to claim the attention, but the pod of us moving as ecosystems born to a larger whole, playful, beautiful, substantial whole. May it be so. Even in shining moments, may it be so.